The only thing worse than losing a fortune is losing it twice. But what's different about this riches to rags story is that William Durant's influence on the world's car manufacturing business is invaluable, even though he died penniless with friends paying his bills while he worked menial jobs in a bowling alley. Depending on who you ask, the creator of General Motors was either a genius whose bold ideas were generations ahead of the market, or a guy whose luck wouldn't have run out if he'd just learned from his own mistakes. However you cut it, the story of William Durant is the quintessential tale of risk management versus ambition. Even JP Morgan called him an unstable visionary. He was one of the first to create a fast food restaurant, and he figured out refrigerators were going to be big when Americans were still fond of their iceboxes. And his innovations in automobiles gave us the Cadillac, the Buick, and the car dealership. For the record, he didn't create the used car dealership, so we can't blame Durant for that one. Yet, this stellar salesman and manufacturing pioneer was unable to predict what would happen if he grew too fast. And he certainly didn't see the Great Depression coming despite his stock market experience. Not only did he lose $19 million in 6 months, but he also figured out how to get rich again, only to lose it all again. But maybe that was part of the plan. Durant seemed to enjoy the challenge of rebuilding an empire, so maybe we can learn more from his downfall than his rise to the top. So was William Durant stuck in a loop? Or had he figured out that markets and fortunes are as cyclical as the ocean tides? The answer to this started in Boston on December 8th, 1861. William Crapo Durant, and yes, you heard that right, his middle name is Crapo, but for the sake of YouTube's monetization overlords, let's just call him Durant. Durant is born to an American mom and pop. However, his grandfather is Henry H. Crapo, a lumber baron and governor of Michigan. But Durant wouldn't become synonymous with Flint, Michigan just yet. Instead, he would spend most of his childhood in Boston, living a seemingly normal life. But when his father abandoned them, the family uprooted to Flint, Michigan to be nearer his grandparents. It was here that 17-year-old Durant dropped out of school to get hands-on experience in the lumber trade. There were expectations of becoming a lawyer, yet Durant was interested in business. Though his grandfather's biz wasn't his calling, there's no doubt he learned the ins and outs of industrial manufacturing. But it turned out he had a real knack for salesmanship. He did help sell lumber, but the first job where he stood on his own 2 feet was as a cigar salesman. Legend has it that he could sell more than 3 other salesmen combined. Here, he perfected his skill in communication, networking, and spotting an opportunity, which is a way of saying he honed the art of the deal. Yet, Flint, Michigan didn't get the nickname Vehicle City until what happened next. The legend goes that one day in 1886, a young man called William Durant was riding in a friend's horse-drawn carriage when he was rather taken with its patented spring suspension. Unlike other rides on the rough roads, this one cushioned his derriere. It was such a pleasant ride, in fact, that Durant immediately hopped onto a train to Coldwater to meet its builder, Coldwater Road Cart Company. Little did he know that this small curiosity would be the catalyst in a vast business empire that would lead to his success and ruin. It's time to learn how history works as we uncover how the founder of General Motors died broke. Upon arriving in Coldwater, Durant became acquainted with the inventor of this horse carriage's suspension. But to secure the patent rights and a cart of his own, he borrowed $1,500 from a bank. Adjusting to $2,024, the 25-year-old Durant would have put down about $50,000. That's still a pretty penny, even if Durant's extended family had wealth. But it's not like they were writing him blank checks every day, so this gamble was likely coming straight out of his inheritance. He then brought on his friend Dallas Dort as partner, and together they founded the Flint Road Cart Company. But with the sizable bank loan over Durant's head, he had to act fast. After completing the paperwork, Durant showcased the cart at a fair in Wisconsin. With an impressive piece of tech and a charming salesman to sell it, Durant returned home with a blue ribbon from the judges and 600 orders from customers. Back in Michigan, he hired a carriage builder to meet the quota and sold the carts for twice what he paid to manufacture them. In the blink of an eye, Durant's little horse carriage company had become a success. Things only got better from there. Less than 7 years after starting their business, Durant and Dort scaled up their operations under the name Durant Dort Carriage Company. Any viewers from Flint, Michigan will no doubt be familiar with this business. By the turn of the century, the company was the largest manufacturer of horse-drawn vehicles. By age 40, Durant was a millionaire, and he was bored. He was itching for another project, but men like Durant often have to wait for the world to catch up with them. In this case, it was waiting for the adoption of the car. In modern times, it's hard to imagine anyone ever thinking automobiles were a passing fad, a bubble made out of concrete highways. Despite the likes of Ford making inroads, and yes, pun intended, people were still clinging on to horses and carriages. And to be fair, Durant was one of them, at least at the start. He found cars to be noisy and loud. Plus, they were more expensive to manufacture, so there was little incentive to risk a business venture. But you can't stop progress. One small startup that was making a name for itself in the emerging automobile industry goes by the name of Buick. However, the great reviews of the original Buick couldn't buttress financial hardship. One of the investors from the fledgling company confided about his financial woes to a friend. He even said they were about to close doors on the company for good. But as fate would have it, the friend that lent an ear to his struggling chum was an executive in Durant Dort Carriage Company. Once Durant heard through the grapevine that a small engine company in his own backyard of Flint needed bailing out, he took a Buick for a spin. He saw with his own eyes, and felt with his own derriere, how the smooth car could climb hills and trek through mud better than his blue ribbon carriages. On November 1st, 1904, Durant took control of Buick at the behest of Buick's shareholders. He reorganised it, streamlined it, and touted its vehicles at a trade show the following January. He returned home with an order for 1,100. 4 years later, Buick was outselling Ford and Cadillac combined. Durant had just salvaged a company on the verge of bankruptcy and made it #1 in production. It seemed Durant had finally found his calling. And others noticed too. One person who recognised how Durant was an industry leader was JP Morgan. He'd already seen success when he set up General Electric and US Steels with partners years prior, so he tried to get the best guys in the car business to form a conglomerate. But his dream team with William Durant, Henry Ford, and Ransom's Old of Oldsmobile fell through following disputes with timing and buying each other out with cash or stocks. But the idea of a holding company became an obsession for Durant. He envisioned a company with different manufacturers and brands. To modern ears, it's a no-brainer that products need their own identity, even if made by the same company. Consumers have brand loyalty, and marketing teams work hard to create an image. But at the turn of the 20th century, this was radical thinking. As risky as automobiles could be, it was clear that if he didn't leapfrog ahead of competition, then he'd be squeezed out. Ford was already getting bigger, so Durant needed to cast a wide net to not lose market share. In 1908, Durant founded General Motors. Then he went on a buying spree, snapping up 30 companies. Some have come and gone like Oldsmobile, but other pages of his portfolio are still around, like Cadillac. Durant was so eager to get the ball rolling that he took a train to Ransom Old's house to wake him up in the middle of the night just to make the deal. Durant even tried to buy out Ford a year later, but the bank wouldn't let him. In fact, it wasn't just the bank that was worried General Motors was spreading itself thin. The board had been taken over in 1910 by a set of bankers who were far more cautious about cars and money in general. But maybe that was a good thing. Sales were drying up in part due to the success of Ford's Model T. Although Durant had acquired a vast collection of car manufacturers and brands, there wasn't a single one whose success was on par with Ford's new hot seller. Overexpansion had bottlenecked resources. As good as the businesses were, there simply wasn't the system in place to support them. Durant had more cards, but not a winning hand. So the board told him to collect his chips and go home. He was ousted, but he remained as another vice president to be a cog in the machine. Anyone would feel hurt from this, yet most people would still be content with a cushy office job and fat paycheck, but not Durant. He got the itch again. In 1911, he set up a new company with race car driver Louis Chevrolet as head engineer. This was the 1910s equivalent of the Air Jordans. That's how far ahead Durant was thinking, and sure enough, the branding helped make the first cars off the assembly line a success. It was so profitable that Chevrolet came to own the majority shares of General Motors. By 1916, he was back in charge of GM. So he simply made Chevrolet another division in his vast manufacturing empire. It was time to bounce back. Durant streamlined his empire by vertically integrating it. Those relationships he'd forged with suppliers and customers helped reduce costs and increase growth. To keep things running smoothly, he also created United Motors Corporation as a holding company for manufacturers. Things like car bodies, electrical systems, and transmissions. That way, as the tech supported the growing automobile industry, he could also streamline the supply chain for General Motors. The real genius stroke is he got that up and running at the start of 1916, about 9 months before he took over GM. So by dominating the supply chain sector, he not only made it easier to get back into GM, he'd laid the groundwork for vertical integration for when he sat in the throne. He even created car dealerships to give his businesses a customer-facing aspect where his salesmanship could shine. Add to that his acquisition of innovative tech like the self-starting motor, and Durant was in the perfect position to take on Henry Ford. Unfortunately, the board didn't agree. Again. In 1920, he was kicked out of the company by Pierre Dupont. Yes, that Pierre Dupont. The family Dupont had become a major stockholder midway between Durant's exile and return from General Motors, and they'd grown sick of his gambles, especially with all his dealings on the stock market. Finances were overextended, cash flow had become strained, debt was mounting. Once again, he'd put the company in a precarious position. The only way to survive was to strike a deal with the board, resign for good, and we'll bail out the company. To put it another way, either he stopped being lead singer and left the band, or the record label would split up the group for good. Durant packed up his things and left the company he founded for the second time. The humiliation must have been unbearable. Breakups are tough, but breaking up twice? Thankfully for him, he'd been in this situation before. He knew what to do. In 1921, he created Durant Motors to rival Ford and even General Motors. You can't say the guy didn't have ambition, but once again he flew too close to the sun. He was too small and they were too big. They were too big because of his success. Most people in this situation would chalk this up to an ironic twist of fate and then retire to Florida to play golf. But old habits die hard. Despite some initial success, Durant once again spread himself too thin and underestimated demand. Maybe he could have pulled through had it not been for the stock market crash of 1929. Thanks to the Great Depression, stocks lost 25% of value, and people were more worried about buying food than buying cars. Overnight, Durant's fleet of car manufacturers were vulnerable. Rather than being strong enough to prop up a new empire, each part was fragile and could bring the whole thing crashing down. He was back at the poker table, but all he had were 2s and 7s. But maybe if he could survive to the next hand, he'd get a lucky break. So in secret, Durant began buying stocks on the margin. He was racked with guilt for the thousands of shareholders who had trusted him with their money. Unfortunately, things didn't pan out. In just half a year, he'd personally lost $90 million trying to keep everything together. After struggling through the Great Depression, the company finally went bankrupt in 1933. Though he hadn't lost all of his fortune, he'd lost most of it and resorted to living off his pension from General Motors. There was no way he'd get back into the automobile industry now, even if he had the knowledge and skills to do it all over again. However, Durant was not shy to challenge, so just like when he saw carriages were going to be replaced by cars, he decided to pivot to the next big thing: bowling alleys. Okay, look, this is a bit of an odd idea, but there is some logic to it. If you've watched the Flintstones or early seasons of The Simpsons, then you'd know how bowling became bigger in between the mid to late 20th century. Whoever came up with baseball must have looked crazy at the time, but fast forward a few decades later, and who's laughing now? I'll tell you who, the creator of baseball. He's laughing all the way to the bank. Durant must have figured that becoming a national chain of bowling alleys was a surefire way to get back on top. Quite a fitting sport for a guy whose life was all about setting things up just to have them knocked down. Still, friends said that even though times were hard, he was enthusiastic about this new venture. Unfortunately, this new business didn't have the immediate success like his others. For starters, there was the location: Flint, Michigan. Never mind that his new bowling alley was in the shadow of one of GM's biggest plants. His flagship location was opposite a church. At the time, bowling and beer weren't exactly the prim and proper thing to do, so setting up across a house of God was surely a bad omen. Then there was the fact that the place wasn't well equipped to be retrofitted. But no matter, Durant had another ace up his sleeve: fast food. He stuck on a drive-through restaurant to his bowling alley to help create a more family-friendly atmosphere. It was called the Horseshoe Inn and was one of America's first fast food enterprises. But don't be shocked if you've never heard of it. It never caught on. Durant's vision for a nationwide chain of bowling alley family eateries was cut short by health problems. In 1942, he experienced a life-changing stroke. He was in no condition to be building a chain of bowling alleys, and it was too late in the game to rebuild his fortune. It was over. He was an old, frail man doing menial jobs to try and keep food on the table, but even that wasn't enough. Up until his death in 1947, Durant depended on friends and former colleagues to help cover bills. One person that came to his aid was the then CEO of General Motors. Maybe some people feel embarrassed to get a handout from the company that fired you, but no doubt Durant saw things differently. His daring vision had not only transformed the world by taking car industries to the next level, he'd transformed his home of Flint, Michigan. It remains the heart of American car manufacturing after all these years. But here's the really interesting thing. Want to guess which state of America has the most bowling alleys? That's right, Michigan. It's part of Michigan's culture, and a fixture of Americana. So even if Durant lost his fortune and companies, he found another way to transform the nation. People might not remember his name, but they know of his achievements. It just goes to show that the only thing worse than falling down is not getting back up again. If you liked this video, be sure to check out our one on US steel to see how rapid growth brought down a titan of industry. And subscribe to keep learning how history works.